Good evening, everybody, and welcome back to yet another program here. Today, Dr. Mohan Sunilkumar is going to be here. He's going to talk on a very important aspect of mental well being. Sleep is known as the window of an opportunity for us to understand how well a person is feeling. It also reflects quality of life, it also reflects on his overall mental well being. So, how do we actually manage sleep disturbances? How do we handle insomnia? And what are the choice of medicines? What really bothers most of us when you're prescribing? Today, Dr. Mohan is going to talk all about insomnia and the prescription details today. Dr. Mohan is doing this series continuously, and today is the sixth of the series, and we have another three more to go. I really thank Dr. Mohan for actually anchoring this program, and we've got excellent feedback from all the viewers till now. And I wish Dr. Mohan keeps it going. Another three more to go. Over to Dr. Mohan Sunilkumar.
Thanks. Thank you, Mahesh. As pointed out by Dr. Mahesh, I think sleep is something which we all look for to understand a person's quality of life or overall well-being. So I'm sure in our clinical practice, a lot of people who come and meet us ask, Doc, can you give me a medication which will help me? Can you give a medication which will help me to sleep much better? So that's a simple question with which a lot of people come down and consult us. So I'll be talking about what kind of challenges we can go through in sleep. And first of all, I'll try to highlight some basic neuroscience in sleep and what actually happens with sleep. And we'll try to understand the nitty-gritties of basic sciences related to sleep. I'll also touch upon the various medications which can be considered and what makes us think of a particular choice and the particular challenges with each of these medicines. How easy or how difficult is it to prescribe these medications and make a choice? And more importantly, I will also talk to you about a lot of things which are very, very important, but many times in a busy clinical practice, we might not emphasize to our patients because a lot of times we do prescribe medications and we believe patients might understand by themselves a lot of other important aspects which can help sleep. We leave it to them to understand, or we tell in a couple of lines like, okay, sleep hygiene is important, take care of your sleep hygiene and leave it. So I'll try to kind of bring in some science and show you how each of these advices can be tailor-made, what you can think of to help effectively the kind of clients you meet and help these people to sleep much, much better. For us to understand sleep, we need to know what exactly would be sleep. Now, sleep is such a complex function. It is very difficult to explain, right? But let me give you some important points of sleep. A person who's in sleep is going to be in something like an altered sensorium or altered state of consciousness, right? And we know that the person is not going to be in one same state of consciousness. We get into deep sleep, very light sleep. Sometimes we are partially awake and we know what's happening around us. So we keep shifting at different levels through the night, right? So the sensorium or the consciousness keeps altering through the night, and it's a complex process which happens. Reversible, obviously sleep is reversible, wherein sometimes technically in medical books they say coma is irreversible, not necessary always, but sleep is reversible. We sleep and we get back to our work and do things. Most important other point is there is a changing responsiveness which happens with sleep, right? There is a constant changing responsiveness which happens. What do you mean by changing responsiveness? We might change in the way we react to the internal world and the external world. Have you noticed some interesting thing which happens in a lot of your patients? Patients who have chronic pain syndromes, patients who have even acute pain or a chronic pain, most commonly will come and say, I've had bad sleep because of my pain. You also know bad sleep can worsen pain further because it decreases the threshold of pain. So what I'm trying to tell you is if you're dealing with a chronic pain syndrome patient, most probably you need to assume you're also dealing with a bad quality of sleep. And the problem here is the bad quality of sleep worsens the pain worsens the sleep. So there's a connection which happens. And we keep responding here. And I'm talking about pain here, it's an internal stimuli. In the same way, if we are sleeping at a very noisy environment, or if we are sleeping in a new environment, the external world can influence our sleep. So sleep is going to keep changing, altered sensorium. It can be reversible. It can be having a changing responsiveness. And most importantly, when we are sleeping, most of us don't move much. Most of us don't move much except a little bit of hand movements, a little bit of leg movements, and those things. We mostly remain quite idle. So that is very characteristic of it. Now, what you need to understand here is in some sleep disorders, patients can have violent movements of limbs. Sometimes they can walk in sleep, they can talk in sleep, all those things can happen. But most of the times, people who sleep have minimal behaviors during sleep. It is important to understand sleep looks like a simple one, but it's a neurobiological cocktail. It's a neurobiological cocktail. The brain has to work in synchrony with a lot of components, a lot of chemicals to kind of bring about sleep or get you off sleep or get into sleep. So it's a neurobiological cocktail, and it's a global process. What do I mean by a global process? You need a lot of brain functioning, and you need a lot of other components in the body which will ultimately decide whether you get good quality of sleep. So sleep is just not dependent on one particular chemical or one particular area. It's a pretty complex global process, and it affects the motor system, it affects the sensory system, it affects the autonomic system, it affects the endocrine system, it affects emotions, it affects the brain activity. So what sleep does not affect is what you have to ask yourself, because sleep seems to affect everything, right from head to toe. It affects us in various ways: motor system, sensory system, the autonomic nervous system, the endocrine system, emotions, and brain activity. So with all this put together, one thing you would have realized is sleep seems to look quite an important task for us. I deal with a lot of students who prepare for entrance exams. I keep telling them it is important to study for these competitive exams, but please ensure that you have a good night's sleep and those things. Try to kind of have good quality of sleep. They immediately say, sir, we have no time, too much to study. What we don't realize here is if you constantly abuse your body by less sleep, you need to realize we will pay a pretty heavy price, because sleep is crux of overall well-being, and it is important for us to respect sleep and give adequate time for sleep. That's something which I would like to highlight here. So when I'm talking about sleep, the word sleep itself has two E's, right? So it's good to remember there are two major components which make you sleep. One is something called as a homeostatic mechanism, and two, it is circadian rhythm. Now, homeostatic mechanism and circadian rhythm are two important methods by which a person gets into sleep mechanisms. Now, this homeostatic mechanism is also called as process S, and circadian rhythm is called as process C. Getting it? What does it mean? If you're talking about circadian rhythm, it is that day night or diurnal kind of variations which happens, right? Majority of the human beings sleep in the night and are awake in the daytime, majority of the times. So that is the circadian rhythm we typically follow. In the same way, there is the homeostatic mechanism. Now, what is this homeostatic mechanism? If you read high school biology, you would know homeostasis is where when you're getting out of the system tries to bring you back to the mean. So whenever you're getting to the boundaries, it tries to bring you back to the middle. So that is called as the homeostatic system. So sleep has two processes. One is the homeostatic process, the other one is circadian process. What is important of this homeostatic process? The importance of homeostatic process is the fact that there is a constant buildup of sleep pressure. There is a constant buildup of sleep pressure. Have you seen one thing? When you get up in the morning, you're kind of pretty much okay. You don't want to sleep. By the afternoon, evening, as the night approaches, slowly you feel tired and lethargic and want to sleep. That buildup which happens is what we call as a sleep pressure. And the sleep pressure, once it reaches the peak, it makes your brain to shut down and puts you into sleep. So that's the component of homeostatic process, or the process S. The circadian rhythm basically works more on biological clock, whereas the homeostatic mechanism is an inbuilt system and pressure. Why this happens, I'll just kind of highlight to you at a later slide. So what you need to understand is, generally speaking, most of the times, this homeostatic process and the circadian process go hand in hand in a very synchronous way, and kind of helps us to get into the sleep in the night, get up in the morning, have a fresh day through the day, and then again in the night feel tired and sleep pressure is very high, makes you sleep, then get up in the next day morning and go on. So this looks so easy for most of us that we don't bother about sleep. But unfortunately, we know a lot of people come and meet us for this problem. One interesting, important, and a serious point I want to highlight here is, a lot of times you will see your patients coming and telling you, Doc, I just cannot sleep. Now you need to understand, most of us will get sleep. It cannot happen that you cannot sleep at all. Why I'm telling this point is because if you're awake for hours and hours and hours, there will be a point of time where the sleep pressure will build up to such a level that it will push you to sleep. Now, what I'm trying to highlight here, I put it in red color and trying to put across and say ability to overpower. This homeostatic sleep is so powerful that it can sometimes overpower your circadian rhythm. Why is it important? Have you seen the number of accidents which happen? And one of the reasons why accidents happen on the roads, especially in the early morning hours, is because the driver dozes off for a few seconds. Now, why would he doze off? Because he's trying to fight the sleep drive over a period of time. The pressure of sleep is building up, but he's trying to keep himself awake, trying to keep himself awake. But it is so powerful that it can actually overpower even circadian rhythm and get you into sleep. This is something we try to utilize in therapeutic process when we are talking to your patients, when you're trying to do cognitive behavioral therapy or sleep retraining. You can explain these things so that patients build enough sleep pressure when they go to the bed, so that when they go to the bed, they actually sleep rather than remain awake. So we need to work with these things. This is one important concept which you should have an idea about. Another important concept which you should have an idea about is this: there is something called as flip flop switch in our brain. Okay, there is something called as a flip flop switch. That's a system we talk about in the brain. So what is this flip flop switch? Any switch will have on and off, right? So same way, this flip flop switch is talking about awake state and a sleep state. Awake state and a sleep state. Now there are chemicals which plays a role in being awake. Chemicals which mainly play a role in being awake are acetylcholine, norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine. These are important chemicals which play a role in being awake. Whereas when you're talking about sleep, GABA, which is an important inhibitory substance, is a substance which plays a role. Galanin is another substance or a peptide which is known to play a role in sleep. So sleep is taken care by two main chemicals, galanin and GABA, whereas awake state is taken by an orchestra of a lot of other chemicals. And I told flip switch. So there should be some switch, right? What will the switch do? It will flip and flop. It will on and off. This on and off, which happens with the flip-flop switch, is taken care by a chemical called orexin. Orexin is a neuropeptide. It is also called as hypocretin. Orexin or hypocretin is a neuropeptide which kind of stabilizes the switch. So it switches it to the on or off and stabilizes it and maintains it. Have you seen sometimes, especially when we go in railways and those things, right? Because a lot of people would have used the switches. Sometimes the switch is little loose. So you put it on, after some time, it'll come back. You put it on, again, it'll come back. So what do? You kind of put a paper or you put a stick to hold it back. That stabilization of the flip-flop switch is done by orexin or hypocretin. That's a simple way to understand whatever orexin will do. So it kind of stabilizes the whole component. Next important point you need to know is a lot of areas in the brain play a role in keeping you awake. A lot of areas in the brain and a lot of chemicals in the brain play a role in keeping you awake. But what about getting you into sleep? one major area which plays a role in getting you into sleep is VLPO. Okay, VLPO is one of the important areas in the brain which kind of plays a role in getting you into sleep. So VLPO is an important place where you need to understand, which induces the sleep, releases the GABA and galanin to take care of you getting into sleep. Whereas multiple areas have to join together and keep you awake. That's an important point. We'll try to touch upon this again in another slide. I did mention to you about sleep drive, right? Picking up sleep drive. And when sleep drive is picking up, what do we do most of the times? When we slowly start feeling lethargic, tired, and sleepy, what is that we do most of the times? We take a cup of coffee. Why do we take a cup of coffee? Coffee we do take is because it is an adenosine antagonist. Now, there is something called as an adenosine accumulation theory. What is this adenosine accumulation theory? As adenosine accumulates in your brain, see, there is a little bit of adenosine. Let's imagine you've got up at 7 o'clock in the morning. This is your brain at 11 o'clock in the afternoon. At maybe 2 o'clock, it has become so much. At about 3 o'clock, at about night 8, 9, 10, it would have got even more filled up. So there is this area in the basal forebrain area. There is a basal forebrain area. When adenosine accumulates over the day continuously, as the adenosine, extracellular adenosine accumulation happens, it increases the sleep drive. As the sleep drive increases, at one point of time, the sleep drive is so much in the basal brain area, it kind of gets you into sleep. So you remember the homeostatic mechanism I told you. That homeostatic mechanism is potentially explained by adenosine accumulation. That is one of the reasons we take an adenosine antagonist. Like we take caffeine, which blocks the adenosine receptors and kind of keeps you awake. Caffeine, when it is taken, it blocks these adenosine receptors and prevents these adenosine action, thereby keeping you awake. Have you not noticed sometimes, especially if you're kind of having a lot of deadlines and work and you don't want to sleep, you gulp one coffee after another to kind of keep yourself awake. But you also would have noticed how much ever you keep yourself awake, at some point of time, the homeostatic drive or the sleep pressure is going to be so high, it will not allow you to be awake. It will make you sleep. It will make you sleep. So you need to understand, you can kind of try to delay this, which can happen. Now, why is this also important is because sometimes when we give psychiatric medications, some of the patients feel drowsy. Now, unknowingly, what can also happen is because they start feeling drowsy, they would have got into the habit of taking more of caffeinated drinks in day-to-day life. Now, they might be on psychiatric medications, which might be making them drowsy. To counteract their drowsiness, they might be taking more of caffeine. Now, we also know as psychiatrists that when somebody is taking a lot of caffeine, they are sometimes going to have more of anxiogenic effect or panic attacks and restlessness, irritability, headache, or sometimes even withdrawal symptoms because they're taking a lot of this caffeine and those. So all those can also lead to the presentation of our symptoms. So it's a good idea when we are seeing a patient who has sleep problems, too much or too less, always ask them, do they take tea, coffee, how many cups per day, to get an idea of, are they sometimes abusing the substances to keep them awake? So these are some useful clinical nuggets which could help. I did mention to you about various chemicals which play a role. To highlight it again, there are these bunch of chemicals which are called as wake on neurons. What do you mean by wake on neurons? These neurons are extremely active when the person is wake or awake. When the person is awake, these neurons are extremely active and firing. Which are the neurons which are active and firing when you're wake on? Serotonin, norepinephrine, histamine, acetylcholine, dopamine, glutamate, which is an excitatory substance, and of course, orexin, which needs to stabilize it. Now, what you need to understand is you would know that sleep also has REM phase, right? Now, REM phase is a little complex phase. So there are two different types of sets of chemicals which play a role in REM phase. For example, there are chemicals which play a role in REM phase. Which are the chemicals which play a role in REM phase? These are called as REM on chemicals. These are called as REM on chemicals. The REM on chemicals are acetylcholine, dopamine, and glutamate. So what happens is when the person gets into the REM phase of sleep, these chemicals are released in much larger amounts. These chemicals are released in much larger amounts. Let me highlight you an interesting point here. A lot of people who do sleep research say your dreams in sleep is almost like a psychotic experience in sleep. People who work in sleep say your dreams in sleep is almost like a psychotic experience in sleep. Now, what is one of the theories we talk about in patients who have psychosis? Your dopamine is released too much, and that's the reason you're getting into hallucinatory experiences, you're hearing voices, you're seeing things, and those. So the same thing here you need to understand is maybe this will make you remember the chemicals which can play a role in REM phase significantly is your acetylcholine, dopamine, and glutamate. Okay, and the REM off means in REM phase, these are least effective. Which are the ones which are least effective? The serotonin, norepinephrine, and histamine are least effective ones you need to understand. Okay, that's something. Now, orexin, as I told you, is stabilizing, especially when you're awake. It kind of stabilizes the switch and keeps you awake. Now, I'm sure you know what is the condition which happens when patients don't have enough orexin being released, or orexin which is being released is not very effective enough. Which is that condition which is linked with orexin? Narcolepsy, right? Narcolepsy is something which you need to remember is linked with orexin. So with this basic understanding, you would know that there are some connections, there are some chemicals which can play a role. And I also told you how circadian rhythm plays a role. So I've given an idea of how the homeostatic pressure builds up with adenosine accumulation. Now, circadian rhythm itself is a huge topic for us to discuss, but let me highlight to you in a simple way like this. Now, if I show you this picture, it almost looks like some scattered planets, like your solar system, right? So why have I drawn this? Your suprachiasmatic nucleus. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is kind of called as the central or the master clock. The suprachiasmatic nucleus is kind of called as the master clock, and it is linked with a lot of other parts of the body, and kind of these are called as peripheral clocks. So we have a lot of peripheral clocks in the body, which gives a sense of time to our brain. And in our brain, you have the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is called as the master clock. Now, this master clock gets stimulated by light. And that is exactly why we know when bright light hits your eyes in the morning, melatonin gets a signal through the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And we know one of the most important things to do is the moment you get up in the morning, if you want to be awake and alert, we always recommend people put on all the lights, open up all the screens, sit in front of the bright light at least for a few minutes, start doing some activity. Because once you start doing activity and you give enough stimuli of bright light to your eyes, the moment you get up in the morning, you're strongly entrenching the signal to the brain telling, boss, this is morning, I need to be awake. Please understand, when I sleep in the night, I need to get my sleep back. So getting the routine in sleep is not just working in the night. You have to start in the morning. So you have to help your clients to understand why is it important to just not keep lying on the bed, get into a bright light zone, start doing things, open up the screens, and those things are very, 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 very important. If you see a lot of adolescent rooms where adolescents separately stay, most of the time is early morning when you go into their room, it's going to be pretty dark and those things. And again, we know in adolescents, they tend to sleep little longer, especially in the early morning hours. The last thing they want from you is you opening up the screen. They get irritated to the core. The reason is because biologically, they want to sleep a little bit more, and you are awakening them, putting up the bright light, which can kind of stimulate this suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the master clock, which is behind playing role in getting the entrenchment of all this, circadian rhythm. Now, I'll just highlight how complex is circadian rhythm. Now, to highlight the component of circadian rhythm complexity, you need to understand the circadian rhythm can be linked to a lot of proteins which play a role and peptides which play a role. Like, there are two important proteins called BMAL and clock. There are genes which are linked to it, the BMAL and the clock. And what happens with this BMAL and clock in circadian rhythm is they produce two important proteins called the PER and the CRY protein. The PER and the CRY protein, which is produced, gets to join together and enter into the cell and actually gives a negative feedback, thereby creating a circadian rhythm. So basically, what I'm trying to tell you here is the circadian rhythm system, which works in our body, needs these peptides and proteins to work in a very cyclical manner without any mistakes. Now, the moment you involve proteins into any circuit, I'm sure you know genetics can play a role, and genetics can definitely play a role. To simply give an example, I'm sure you would have heard about something called as phase shift. For example, let's imagine normally we sleep at 11 o'clock in the night and get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. Let's imagine we are sleeping at 11 o'clock in the night, 7 o'clock in the morning. What happens typically in adolescents and young adults? It shifts, right? They want to sleep at 2 o'clock in the night and want to get up at 9, 10 or so. Whereas in elderly people, you see there is advancement of the phase. What happens? They prefer to go off to sleep at 8:39ish, and by 3, 4 in the morning, they get up. So this is phase advancement and phase delay. In adolescents, there is a delay, whereas in elderly people, there is a phase advancement which happens. Now, why I'm stressing this point here? I'm stressing this point here is because a lot of studies say this PER gene, PER, PER gene, that is PER is nothing but called as a period protein or PER gene. This is linked with phase delay, the CRY protein, and the clock protein, which I told you earlier, and CRY sometimes is linked with the phase advancement. So this is a basic understanding for you to understand genetics also can play a role in sleep issues. Now, it's good to know how complex sleep is so that we understand and deal with sleep in a much more better way. Now, why am I talking these things as an important aspect? The reason I'm talking about these things is because as a psychiatrist, I'm very concerned about one important point. What is the important point? If you have insomnia, it basically 2-3 years of insomnia. If you have a couple of years of insomnia, but 3 years or more, anxiety almost is 2 times more. Depression is almost 4 times more. Substance use disorders are also way much commoner, almost like 7 times more in people who have insomnia for 3 to 5 years. Now, what I'm trying to tell you here is if you don't identify insomnia in people, and if you don't help these people to take care of their insomnia, we are actually worsening their quality of life over a period of time, because they are going to be more prone to anxiety, more prone to depression, more prone to substance use disorder. And I'm sure, see in our routine practice, a lot of people abuse substances because of these various reasons. Now, an interesting point, I'm sure a lot of our patients also would come and tell us is, Doc, I don't know why I'm not sleeping very well these days, and I get pretty frustrated and I get very angry these days. Now, do you know one interesting point here? If you don't sleep well, it's known to cause some kind of an emotional problem and get you into a lot of challenges. It's very clear that if you have sleep disturbances for a few days, just few days of sleep disturbance seems to have negative bias towards emotions. What it does, it decreases the motivation. First of all, if you have sleep disturbance for a few days, that is enough to decrease your motivation, and it also decreases the chances of you looking for a positive outcome. The people start becoming very negative. How many times have we not seen people who don't have sleep for a few days and they become paranoid and suspicious and worried? and so anxious that they want to sleep. So we wonder, why are they becoming so negative and upset? You need to understand, just sleep deprivation for a few days can make your motivation low. It can actually increase the chances of you looking for negative outcomes which can happen. Moreover, the ability to implement the changes becomes lesser. One of the challenges you will see in a lot of your patients with sleep problems is, you'll tell them, see, I'll give you a simple technique to follow. Just do this. Just maintain, what time did you get up? What time did you sleep? This looks like a simple task for us, but these patients would not be able to do it, not because they don't like us, not because they don't want to follow. You need to understand the reason is because when they don't sleep well, sleep deprivation is known to reduce motivation. It is known to reduce implementation ability, their ability to do goal directed activities and complete the tasks goes low. So all of those can make your treatment and strategies work very differently. I did mention to you that brain, over a period of time in the day, it accumulates a lot of toxins, right? Let's imagine a lot of toxins and a lot of metabolites and other unwanted chemicals which are getting accumulated in the brain. As it gets accumulated, what happens? Let's imagine this guy whose brain is this, which has a lot of toxins and metabolites which have got accumulated. Now he goes into sleep. The moment he goes into sleep, a lot of drainage of these toxins happen in the night. So why should you sleep? In a simple way is because to clear up, it is a detoxification which we do to ourselves every single night. So when we sleep, the toxins get removed in the night and it kind of gets cleared up. So the next day morning we get up, our brain is reset and says, boss, I'm ready for the next day. So that is what your lymphatic, there is some system called as glymphatics. You would have heard about lymphatics in the rest of the body. There is something called as glymphatics, G. Glymphatics, they clear up all the toxins and metabolites and all the unwarranted substances, the free radicals and those things. So basically, it's like a reset button, clearing up your kind of most important organ, the brain, every night when you sleep. That's something which you need to kind of know. Now, with this basic understanding of what and why about sleep, let's talk about something which is very clinically relevant and makes a point here. We need to know what, how, and why we should diagnose sleep problems. Especially, I'm going to talk about insomnia here. Now, for you to say somebody is having sleep problem, especially insomnia, we have to look for some features, right? Now, patients themselves will come and tell, I'm not sleeping well. Is that enough for us to diagnose? We have to look at some important characteristics. First of all, you have to ask yourself is, do they have distress? Do they feel distressed about the sleep problem? Is the question. Are they worried about sleep? Are they disturbed about sleep? Are they disturbed about the amount of hours they are sleeping? Are they disturbed about the quality of their day? All those things. If they're distressed, then it's an important criteria to say it's a significant issue. Second, you also want to see whether there is a dysfunctionality which is happening because of their sleep problems. See, I might have little less sleep today, but I might still function absolutely fine tomorrow. That might not require any kind of treatment as such. But if it goes on to a level of dysfunctionality, where my cognitive abilities, my physical abilities, my psychological abilities, emotional abilities, if those things go toss, then you need to understand there is a significant dysfunctionality. So it's always a good idea to ask, how distressed are they about their sleep problem? It's always good to check, how does it cause dysfunction in their day-to-day functioning? So when you get to know these things, then you'll be able to help them uh, with the right medication choices. A very important thing which we sometimes don't even ask, but we assume they have given enough opportunity to sleep. Getting it? Why I'm stressing this point is because a lot of young people who are working in corporate world will come and meet, especially with the startup environment, right? We know a lot of people who are working in startups, they come and meet us and say, doc, I'm not able to sleep for last 3 weeks. I asked them, okay, how hectic is your work? They say too much. I have a deadline, and we are kind of coming up with a new product. So till the end of the month, we are working 18 hours. Now, if a person is working 18 hours plus, obviously they're not even giving enough time for them to have an adequate sleep, right? So they are giving very little time and expecting them to sleep, and with so many things running in their head, they're not giving enough opportunity. So by definition, for you to say, okay, this person is actually going through not sleep deprivation but insomnia, you have to see whether they're given enough opportunity to sleep. As clinicians, many times we assume these things, but it's a good idea for us to check whether these problems are happening. Some interesting points which will be very crucial for us to understand is because, see, a lot of times patients would be vague. Let's say I have sleep problem and they would not be able to explain much. But how do you still decide, okay, should I add a medication or not? Should I take a sleep problem as a concerning point or not? How do you decide those points? So for you to decide those points in specific, that is where you have to look at some interesting things. Like, what should you look for? One is there a latency in sleep? Normally speaking, people, when they go to bed, within about 20 minutes to maximum 30 minutes, they sleep off. From the time they get to the bed, in 20 to 30 minutes, they sleep off. But these people with insomnia generally will be awake more than 30 minutes. So asking whether they're awake more than 30 minutes will give you an idea whether they have insomnia or not. More than 30 minutes of wakefulness. A lot of times, we all might get up once or twice in sleep, right? We might be briefly awake and we sleep off without our knowledge. So, especially in elderly people, we know because of the prostate changes and those things, they might need to go to the restroom a couple of times, or because of the diabetic status, they need to use the restroom a couple of times. So they might get up a couple of times and go back to sleep. Now, that's not a problem because they need to get up because of their bowel and bladder needs, but that's a different issue. But what you need to understand is, are they getting back to sleep or not? Normally, within 30 minutes, they get off to sleep, and totally they might not be awake more than 30 minutes. But if they're awake more than 30 minutes in a night, and consistently, if it is keep on happening, then you can take it very seriously and try to see what is to be done to address. A very important point for us, which is very clinically useful tool, is what's the sleep efficiency of the patient who is sitting in front of us. You need to ask ourselves, what's the sleep efficiency? What is sleep efficiency, by the way? Sleep efficiency is, like, for example, you need to ask the patient, what time did you go to the bed? What time did you get up from the bed? Let's imagine a patient is lying from 8 o'clock in the night till 8 o'clock in the morning on the bed. From 8 in the night, he is lying down 8 in the morning on the bed. And he says, Doc, I only slept from 2 o'clock till 8 o'clock. So what is the sleep efficiency then? The number of hours slept, that is 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock, right? So 6 hours. 6 hours divided by 12 hours. So 50% is the sleep efficiency. So what is sleep efficiency? The number of hours you sleep divided by the number of hours you are on the bed. Now, this efficiency normally should be at least 85% or more to say somebody is having a good quality of sleep. So it's a very useful parameter which you can use by simple calculation, asking patients about how many hours are they on the bed, how many hours are they sleeping. You'll get the sleep efficiency. And our aim is to get it beyond 85%, 85% plus. That's the target of our treatment most of the times when you're working with them. When it is less than 85%, think of insomnia. In terms of hours, we do know there are very, very light sleepers needing only 5.5 hours, 6 hours and all. But average, a lot of times 7 to 8 hours is what people need. And anybody who's sleeping less than 6.5 hours, until unless you have reasons to believe they have insomnia, it's a good idea to believe they have insomnia. So when you're talking about insomnia, 1 day of sleeplessness is not insomnia. 2 days of sleeplessness is not insomnia. For us to kind of clinically diagnose, at least DSM says, you need to look for at least 3 months of insomnia to say, yes, this person is having insomnia, 3 months. And not just one night occasionally, you need to have at least 3 nights per week. It should affect the quality and quantity of sleep with a lot of negative consequences in functioning, mood, cognitions, emotions, and energy. All those things should happen for you to say, yes, this person is potentially having sleep issues. So if you want to talk about sleep, you need to understand, you have to ask these 2 important points to all the clients. What are you supposed to talk to them? One is ask them about baseline sleep routine. One is to ask them about baseline sleep routine. A lot of times patients are so distressed about their sleep, so they want to talk to you about the problems which they're going through. So before you get carried away with the problems, you have to ask them an important question is, let's imagine before this 6-8 months where you have had sleep issues, in your so-called normal time, what time were you sleeping? What time were you getting up? What is the average sleep efficiency? Would you be getting dreams? Would you be not getting dreams? You ask all this kind of questions and kind of deal with it. That's when you can actually help these people to kind of clinically get better. And second important point, which we should never forget asking them, is problems during sleep. You need to always ask them, okay, what are the problems you go through during sleep? Do you get up multiple times in between? Are there dream issues? Are there talking behaviors? Are there walking behaviors? Are there involuntary movements? Are there anything else which others have no? They might have bed partners, right? You can ask them, what does the person who's sleeping next to you complain about? Have they complained about anything? Most of the times, we will not know we are snoring until our partner comes and tells you are snoring. So it's important for us to understand that asking people on baseline routine is very important, because when you treat them, you want to reach to their baseline, right? And sometimes people have unrealistic expectations. So if you want to bring down their unrealistic expectations, it's a good idea for you to have a baseline sleep assessment. So that's something you should do. So to highlight this point, let me show you a beautiful, simple picture I've created for you to kind of remember this point. The picture is, just a second. Yeah, I got it. Whenever you want to assess a person of sleep, forget about prescribing medication. You should be able to do it. But the point is, if you don't assess well, you don't really help these people. So assessing sleep is almost like an art, according to me. It's a skill for assessing sleep. So I've tried to keep it very simple for you to understand. So when you're assessing sleep, you ask people, do they have a pre-sleep routine, first of all? What do they do before they enter into sleep? In today's world, what do you think is the pre-sleep routine for most of them? I'm sure you're thinking in your head, right? Watching Netflix, Amazon, or binge watching something on YouTube. So looking at the screen for a long time. So these are things which typically people do. So pre-sleep routine. What is the pre-sleep routine? Some of them do extensive exercise just before sleep. So you need to understand that could be the part of their pre-sleep. Some people pray, some people eat. So all of those things can happen as a pre-sleep routine. So asking patients what is the pre-sleep routine, what is the sleep latency from the time they go to bed, how much time do they take to fall into sleep? Do they get up in between? How many times do they get up? And every time when they get up, what is the average time they take to get back to sleep? What are the activities during the sleep? Do they talk during sleep? Do they walk during sleep? Do they do any other complex behaviors during sleep? Do they remember those activities? Have the partners complained about some particular issues during sleep? All those things will help us. Also, things in sleep. For example, do they have very bad dreams? All those things will give you an idea what you're supposed to do with these people. Dreams, hours of sleep, perception is an extremely important component you should assess for, because how do they perceive their sleep to be? What do they feel their quality of sleep is? All those things will help you to help these people in a much better way. And when you're dealing with insomnia in specific, most important point you need to always look for is is there a very specific precipitant factor? Like, for example, very recently we saw a patient who has been having about 4-5 months of insomnia, and we know that started off with the person's partner dying of COVID because of the recent pandemic and those things. So, and the person died suddenly because of the COVID, and the news came to them at about 1 o'clock in the night. So every day, 1 o'clock or so, the person panics and very bad, and it is only related after this event which has happened. So getting to know whether there is a precipitant factor will help us to help them in many ways. More importantly, it is always good to look for medical conditions and mental health conditions which could be associated with poor sleep. It's always good to assess for medical conditions and mental health problems, because most of the times it's a good rule to assume that most of these people will have some mental health problem and or medical problem which is also comorbid with their sleep issues. So these are some important points we need to look at. Now, there are various rating scales and other things which you can also read up to know how to assess for insomnia and other points. But let me highlight you some important aspect. One of the best ways to know about a client's sleep issue is to ask them to maintain something called as a sleep diary. What is a sleep diary? A sleep diary is a documentation, at least for prospectively 2 weeks. This is very important because a lot of times my patients will say, if I ask them, okay, can you maintain a sleep diary? They'll say, so I know about my sleep problems. I'll tell you now itself. I say, see, I've understood that, but I want you to maintain it for next 2 weeks and come back and meet me. Why prospective is because whatever they tell historically, it gives you an idea about what is actually happening. But when they collect specific data and come back and meet you, that is when exactly you know what is the real challenges which is happening, what is their expectations, and you're asking for specific data points for you to get to know the diagnosis or help them in the best way. So prospectively asking them to maintain the document will help. What data points of sleep should you look for? Initiation, maintenance, termination, total time, sleep, and non-sleep time, all those things. What do you mean by sleep and non-sleep time? For example, if they're sleeping, how much time do they sleep? If they're not sleeping, how much time are they awake in between? And what do they do during those times? So a lot of people have the habit, when they don't sleep in between, they go and smoke, especially if they're into nicotine use, they go and smoke. Now, I don't need to tell you as a doctor, anybody knows if you smoke a cigarette, you will further find it difficult to sleep. So it makes no sense for somebody in between sleep to go and smoke and come back. And if you ask this person, they'll say, I feel bored, I'm not getting sleep, so I didn't know what to do. I went and had a smoke. So you need to realize, if you don't get this data point that they're smoking in the night, you might not, you might put them on medications, you might put them on hypnotics, you might put them on sedatives, but will it help them? Not necessarily, because you haven't taken care of their sleep hygiene. And how do you take care? Is to ask them, I'm awake. When they say I'm awake, you always ask them, they're awake for 4 hours. So what did you do? They say, no, I was watching TV. 4 hours watching TV. Then they said, no, I was watching TV. Then I was playing. Then I was chatting with somebody. So you need to realize they have some friends who stay in other part of the globe, which means the other friend is active in the daytime. This person is supposed to be sleeping, but is not sleeping because of insomnia. And sometimes people are in long distance relationships. So they have to maintain relationships. So they connect at odd hours. So you need to realize, if you don't get these data points, we would not be able to help these people. And also importantly, when you're checking with these activities, you should always ask them, on some particular days, you mentioned that you've slept well. What are the things which have aided sleep on that day? What are the things which have interfered you on that day with your sleep? And what are the activities you do other than related to sleep and those things? So what is the sleep aiding and sleep interfering activities? One of the common problems which happens is a lot of people have the myth or the misconception that alcohol can help sleep. Now, alcohol to some extent might induce sleep to some extent, but we also know when people abuse alcohol over a period of time, it also leads to fragmentation of sleep and other issues. So it might aid sleep initially, but over a period of time might become the problem. So it can also turn out to become sleep interfering. So sometimes people will say, I'm able to sleep well on a day when there is not much of stress, on days when I have deadlines and stress. So, you need to teach them some relaxation techniques and those to calm down. So like that, working on these areas will help them to handle sleep and those things. Asking them, what is the quality of their overall sleep on a particular day? Checking about the quality will help on the sleep diary. And look at perception about sleep and ask them to document in their sleep diary. So what about perception? You need to ask them, before they go to sleep, what do they feel about sleep itself? A lot of times, people with chronic insomnia will come and tell you, Doc, every day when I go to bed, I'm afraid to go to bed. Now, you might wonder, all of us like to go to bed because that's the time when we want to shut down. But these people haven't slept for a few days, they find it so difficult. So for them, sleeping is a task. So perception problems is pre itself. Even before sleep, they have issues. During sleep, have they had any perceptual changes? And post sleep, how do they look at their sleep and quality? So when you get all these data points which are put up on the slide, then you have kind of assessed these patients in a much more sensible way, and you have realized, okay, these things can play a role in some way or the other. Now, before I kind of talk on how to handle the treatment, one simple summary point I would like to say is insomnia is very complex, right? Substances can help insomnia, substances can cause insomnia. Drugs can help insomnia, drugs can cause insomnia. Diseases can help insomnia, diseases can cause insomnia. Disorders can help insomnia, disorders can cause insomnia. These activities can help or cause insomnia. So if you see, lot of things can cause or create trouble. It's very difficult for us to say what's going to happen in a particular individual. That is exactly why a good detailed assessment is much more important point of treatment than actually prescribing a medication or teaching some skill sets to handle those things. So we are always at a lookout for some ideal hypnotic, right? We want to look for ideal hypnotic. Now, ideal hypnotic would be something, if you give the patient, it should immediately sleep off, it should be short acting so that morning when he gets up, he's absolutely fresh, and it should mimic real sleep, the same phases, the same dreams, the same things. We want it to be ideal. It should not be substance dependent producing, it should not be habit forming. Whenever we remove it, it should not be causing withdrawal symptoms. We don't want patients other problems to worsen because of it. We don't want weight gain to happen. We don't want any other problem to happen. Such a kind of ideal hypnotic idealistically will never happen in this real world. But we are always in lookout for this ideal hypnotic, which will really mimic natural state. As I emphasized in the initial phase, it's a cocktail, it's a neurobiological cocktail. And I don't think at any point of time, one medical drug will take care of this whole cocktail. It will never ever happen, according to me. Now, what I want to highlight here is a few important points. Now, one important point I want to highlight here is this. When you talk to your patients, what is a common problem you have seen? A lot of our patients will say, Doc, I stopped the medicine. I wanted to see. I asked them, what did you want to see by stopping medicine? I wanted to see whether I can sleep well. And I tell my patients, man, I'm giving you medication which is not for sleep. I'm giving you an antidepressant. And why are you trying to stop this to see whether you're sleeping well or not? The reason I'm trying to highlight this point is because there is a majority of the times people believe psychiatry medications are given to make them sleep well. Now, we do know a lot of our medications might aid sleep or might have a side effect of sleep or might be a hypnotic which induces sleep. So, a lot of our patients tend to believe that. That is not their problem. But what you need to understand is when we give antidepressants, which is one of the commonest prescription drugs we use as a psychiatrist, we need to understand there are some which can help sleep. There are some which might not help sleep. So there are some which decreases the sleep. What are the ones which decreases the sleep? Typically, even though there are few patients who might feel sedated with SSRIs, but you need to understand almost all SSRIs can also reduce sleep. Almost all SSRIs can also reduce sleep. Fluoxetine, fluoxamine are two common culprits in it. Fluoxetine, fluoxamine are two common culprits, but you need to understand all SSRIs to some extent in some people can reduce sleep. But you also know in some, it actually is very sedative and makes them sleep a lot. So it happens in different ways, but you should be looking for changes in sleep when SSRIs are given. SNRIs, which is also dual-acting antidepressants, they also sometimes can reduce sleep. Bupropion is one important drug which can be quite a common culprit in reduction of sleep, we need to understand. In the same way, there are some antidepressants which can be pretty much useful in sleep. useful in sleep or kind of inducing sleep. Mirtazapine. Now, the problem with mirtazapine as an antidepressant is we stop mirtazapine in many patients for two main reasons. One is weight gain, two is too much sedation. These are two common problems which makes us stop mirtazapine in a lot of patients when we give it as an antidepressant. Trazodone. Trazodone is another drug which is also known to be an antidepressant, which can induce a lot of sleep and can be used in sleep issues. Tricyclic antidepressants can also be quite sedative in nature. So that's something which I wanted to highlight here. Technically, you need to understand most of the times a hypnotic dose, if you want to give any of these medications, especially the antidepressants to help sleep, it should be generally given at a smaller dosage. Hypnotic dose is way much more smaller than the antidepressant dosage. So trazodone to have antidepressant effects easily requires 100 to 200 mg. Whereas if you are wanting to give it more like an hypnotic, you can give, many times we see patients responding well at 25 to 50 mg itself. So trazodone or mirtazapine, both, if you see, even tricyclics, a small dose works as a hypnotic. For an antidepressant effect, we need to hike up the dosage much more commonly. Now, one interesting point I would like to highlight is SSRIs is one common prescription we give, right? A lot of our patients will come and tell you one thing. After I've started this medication, I'm having a lot of dreams. I'm kind of having vivid dreams. I'm not able to say whether it is a reality or a dream. So a lot of changes in dream experiences is quite a common problem with SSRIs. Now, why is this important is because if any of your patients come and talk about it, you could always do is, if the patient has otherwise responded well with the medication, instead of handing a benzodiazepine or some other drug to make them sleep better, many times I've seen just changing the dosage of the medication to the afternoon or the morning sometimes helps their quality of sleep to get better. So one of the skills which I've learned over a period of time, which I have felt is very useful clinically, is in all patients who respond well, but say, sir, I'm taking this medicine in the night, but it is causing some sleep problems. Could it be the medicine? I always tell them, before I add some other medication to help you to sleep, can we do one thing? Can you give a try for 2 weeks to 3 weeks where you shift it to the morning and the afternoon and see, can you manage it in the morning? Does your quality of sleep in the night improve? And many times, especially with SSRIs, I've seen when they shift it to the morning or the afternoon, the night quality of sleep gets better. Can you imagine how many more patients we might not put on benzodiazepines if we just follow this simple strategy? So it's a good idea for us to look at these things to deal with some of these scenarios. We also ask, okay, are you sleeping more sedative? Okay, we understand it's because of the medicine. That's something which we should definitely look for. But you should also look for insomnia because of medicine. You should also look for sleep apnea because of medicine. You should also look for restless leg syndrome because of medicine. SSRIs can cause restless leg syndrome very commonly. Sleep apnea, benzodiazepines are a huge culprit. Any other psychotropics also can cause. Hypersomnia can happen as a component of many, many medications. Insomnia, as I was just mentioning, can also happen. So, in fact, all of these choices are some things which you should seriously look for. So, it is not just only looking for sedative effect. You should also look for other components. I'll tell you, if you ask about restless leg syndrome in next 100 patients you see, one single question, you will diagnose almost every single day at least even one patient with restless leg syndrome. If you tomorrow onwards, I mean, if you're already asking, great and good. If you're not asking, try to ask about restless leg syndrome in people. You will pick it up. And a lot of our psychiatry patients who have sleep issues, we might be thinking it's a psychiatry problem, it's the anxiety, it's the insomnia, but actually they might be having restless leg syndrome. Sometimes they want to meet a neurologist, get assessed for other conditions, and take proper medications, they get better. So it's always good for looking for these other reasons which could be happening and help these patients in the best way. So when we look for these reasons. So I already mentioned to you about some of these drugs, right? So let me run through a couple of these points as quick as possible. Like mirtazapine is one of the drugs which we use sometimes as drugs which can aid sleep in people. Now I'm talking about the unusual drugs which we use because commonly we will always use the Z-class drugs and benzodiazepines, but I'm trying to highlight you uh, as a psychiatrist, when especially in my initial years when I started practice, If anybody is telling sleep issues, my immediate go-to drug is to put them on some clonazepam or alprazolam, especially clonazepam, because alprazolam, personally, I would believe, okay, it's causing a lot of habit forming potential abuse. So I used to put people on clonazepam. Patients would be better. I would be very happy. The problem would start is when patients find it difficult to get away from medication. So over years, I've realized it's easy to put people on benzodiazepine and expect them to get better. But when we have alternative choices to think of, a lot of times I've found we don't unnecessarily put people on benzodiazepine. So it's a good idea for us to ask ourselves, are we seeing a patient with a little bit of depressive symptoms, and maybe will some of these other drugs help? Like, for example, mirtazapine has an antagonistic effect at alpha-2 receptors, 5-HT2A receptors, 5-HT2C receptors, and 5-HT3 receptors. Now, this does play a role in its antidepressant effect. But what plays a role in sedative effect? The 5-HT2A antagonism and alpha-1 antagonism. Okay, alpha-1 antagonism and 5-HT2A antagonism of mirtazapine is known to play the role of sedation. One of the other clinical choices which people think of is tricyclic antidepressants, right? When they use tricyclic antidepressants, we always use it for its antagonistic effect in serotonin transporters and the norepinephrine transporters. It is an inhibitor of serotonin transporter and the norepinephrine transporter. Thereby, it increases the serotonin levels and the norepinephrine levels, and thereby helps the patient in the depression. That's why we use this. But you need to understand, tricyclic antidepressants have a lot of other effect, and it works on the alpha-1 receptors, H1 receptors, and muscarinic receptors. Because of its effect on alpha-1 receptors and H1 receptors, it has sedative effect. And that is one of the reasons why we consider using tricyclic antidepressants in some of these patients. Getting it? That's another important agent which we consider using. Now, I also mentioned to you about we use trazodone is potentially one of the other drugs which we use. Now, trazodone again works on H1 receptor, alpha-1 receptor blockade, and the 5-HT2A receptor blockade. Thereby, it plays a role in its antidepressant effect. So one of the drugs which is ill utilized by all of us is something related to the sun. You remember something which I told you about bright light hormone, which is linked with light, suprachiasmatic nucleus, and those melatonin. Melatonin is a hormone which is released and plays a role in circadian rhythm. Now, you need to understand there is melatonin 1 receptors and melatonin 2 receptors. Melatonin 1 receptor basically plays a role in sleep onset, and melatonin 2 receptors basically plays a role in circadian rhythm. Melatonin 1 receptor in sleep onset, circadian rhythm is taken care mainly by melatonin 2 receptors. Can you name the drug which plays a role with melatonin? You have melatonin itself being sold in the market, right? Melatonin itself is available. And especially some of your clients, if they're coming from US and those, they would have almost tried melatonin all by themselves because it's over the counter available. A lot of times, a lot of companies sell melatonin in the supermarkets out there. So what happens is melatonin is quite commonly consumed by people to get rhythm back. Now, let me highlight an important clinical point here. When we give melatonin, it will not be like a sedative or an hypnotic cause sleep. It can aid sleep, it can help sleep, but it is more a drug which brings the circadian rhythm pretty much in check and control. So it's important for us to highlight this point because patients sometimes when we prescribe them on melatonin, they think if I take melatonin, within 15 minutes they'll feel sleepy and they'll go and lie down. Many a times it doesn't cause such kind of a sedation at all. There are people who do say it causes significant sleep and sometimes sedation is a problem. But majority of the times, you need to understand melatonin is a great drug of choice if you can if you want to regulate the rhythms in sleep, especially when you're dealing with people who are into digital addiction behaviors and looking screens for a long time, have got haywire, delayed phase responses, when you want to work with them, and resistant depression and those where we are working with people with a lot of sleep issues chronically. I've seen melatonin, when you're not using melatonin as a hypnotic agent here. You're using melatonin as a circadian rhythm agent. So looking at not just sleep, but circadian rhythm could really help many of these patients to really get better. That's something which we should look for specifically to deal with. We did speak about benzodiazepines to some extent, the GABA receptors to some extent when we spoke about anxiolytic last week. So you can go and look at that video also for you to learn more about benzodiazepines. Here, you need to understand benzodiazepines basically work on alpha unit. And see, between the alpha unit and the beta unit, you actually have the GABA receptor which is sitting between the. mm, so this benzodiazepine which is there, right, works on specific alpha units. Now, what happens here with benzodiazepines is it does not work on two specific alpha units, the alpha 4 and the alpha 6. Benzodiazepines don't work. And another important point you need to understand is between the alpha 1, 2, 3, and 5, alpha 1 is basically known to have effect on sleep, is known to have effect on sleep. Now, why this is important? Benzodiazepines are positive allosteric modulators. Z-class drugs are positive allosteric modulators of the GABA receptors. Both are positive allosteric modulators. Benzodiazepines typically just don't work on alpha receptors. It might work on alpha 2, alpha 3 to some extent, and sometimes even alpha 5. Other than alpha 4 and alpha 6, it seems to work on alpha 2, 3, 5, and alpha 1. So it can cause some sleep. It can also cause some anxiolysis. It can be working with benzodiazepines. But when you come to Z-class drugs, zolpidem, zaleplon, and S-zopiclone, the Z-class drugs, they specifically are more known to be selective to work on alpha 1 receptors. So because they work on alpha 1 receptors, they are more sedative in nature only, and they don't have a much of an anxiolytic effect. That's an important point for us to learn here. Okay, so alpha 1 specific is your Z-class drugs, whereas benzodiazepines works on alpha 1, 2, 3, and 5. That's an important point. Now, this alpha 5 is linked with cognitions. One of the complaints, if you see in your patients, when you put them on benzodiazepines, is they'll say, Doc, I'm getting better sleep, I'm okay, but I'm finding it difficult to remember some words. I find it difficult to remember what I'm doing in the last few hours just before I sleep after I've taken the medication. They complain of memory problems, cognitive problems sometimes. So what could be the culprit there? The benzodiazepine which we are giving in these patients to reduce their anxiety or sleep might be working on the alpha 5 subunit of the GABA receptor and actually causing cognition issues. So that's something which you should look for in our patients and try to see whether we can change the benzodiazepine or even remove benzodiazepine in those patients. I did touch upon Z-class drugs here, right? Last time we did speak about benzodiazepine, so I'll not touch much there. So Z-class drugs, zaleplon, zolpidem, esopiclone are important. The shortest one is zaleplon. Esopiclone is the longest half-life drug out of the Z-class drugs. So you need to understand, because it is the shortest, the zaleplon is very useful in initiation, or somebody who gets up in between in the night. If they take zaleplon, it will help them to sleep better. But I haven't used it because I don't think it's widely available in India, so we might not be able to easily use it across. Now, zolpidem is quite easily available in India, and there is an extended formulation as well as a plain one. It is useful in initiation and maintenance, and a lot of studies try to say it has a little bit of almost physiological equivalent sleep. It tries to, especially they say the extended release, at least the companies who promote extended release say it has a faster action and a maintenance action, thereby almost like to mimic a real sleep. And we've seen patients also responding pretty well with zolpidem extended release kind of formulations. Esopiclone, at least when the drug was marketed very heavily by a lot of these pharmaceutical companies, I would see it used to work pretty well. But these days, the supply of these medications have come down, very difficult to get for a lot of patients and those, but seems to work in selective patients. But one of the side effects a lot of patients would complain is metallic taste, which is one of the challenges which could happen with esopiclone. An interesting point I would like to mention here is, you remember I told you that switch stabilizer, orexin, right? That orexin is also called as hypocretin, which is other name for orexin. There are two important orexins or hypocretin, hypocretin 1 and hypocretin 2. Now, hypocretin 1 is basically something which works in relation to dopamine. Hypocretin 2 works in relation to histamine. So because histamine is more linked with obviously sleep, you need to understand hypocretin 2 is linked with sleep. But hypocretin 1, there are a lot of studies to see that orexin seems to have a lot of effect on some addictive behaviors, reward behaviors, motivation behaviors, and those things. So a lot of work is happening to find out whether some changes in orexin molecule antagonism, agonism, can they bring in new molecules to modulate behaviors, and those, that's something which they're coming up and looking at. Suvorexant is one of the FDA approved drugs, which is linked with hypocretin, right? What is this suvorexant? It is a DORA. What is DORA? It's a dual orexin receptor antagonist. DORA is suvorexant is a chemical which is a DORA, which is nothing but dual orexin receptor antagonist, which is seemingly effective in patients with insomnia and those. So these are some important drugs which we need to know. Now, before we wind up, this is something I would like to highlight. And I think if you ask me, this is the most important point of the whole discussion, because a lot of times we miss the bus in these areas and we don't talk about these things to our patients. There are a lot of psychological interventions which are very, very useful in patients with sleep issues. The best point of these psychological interventions, unlike a lot of other psychological interventions, for example, if you're doing DBT for borderline therapy, it's a tough process, long-standing process, a lot of training is required, even for the professional to go through. You're dealing with self-harm behaviors, therapy, it's a complex things. In insomnia, therapy is simple, very powerful, and very useful. One of the important things you need to understand is you need to respect this place in your house, flat, apartment, wherever you stay. This place is to be respected. Which is the place I'm talking about? The bedroom. The bedroom temperature has to be adequate enough. The bedroom light has to be appropriate. Obviously, when you're sleeping, it should be dim lit or no light. Some people prefer to have a small light somewhere on the corner. It's a good idea to have it. Have no noise or minimal noise. If possible, some white noise in the background could also be very soothing. Okay, so what you need to understand is the environment in which the person sleeps is extremely important. There's no bargain or excuse in it. They have to work on the temperature, light, and the noise. Especially if you have an AC attached in your room, you can always ask the clients to kind of bring down the AC temperature to 17, 18 degrees, which kind of brings down the core temperature and help them significantly. Another important point to emphasize in people is bringing up a lot of soothing routines. They need to build up a lot of soothing routines. One is definitely you need to ask them to avoid stimulants and stimulatory activities, to avoid caffeine, alcohol, and smoke, bring down the core body temperature. One of the best things which is very effective is to take warm water, little bit hot water shower. Now, hot water shower sometimes looks like contradictory, right? It looks like you'll be more awake. But when you take a hot water shower and if your room temperature is pretty low, what happens is there's a dip in your core body temperature, which can induce sleep is noticed. So it seems to be effective in some people. And it's always good to get into a routine. If you see, as kids, when we are growing up, a lot of parents would say, okay, have a small cup of milk, or they want to give you a cup of curd, or they want to kind of make you eat 2 small dry fruits, or they want to bring some routine, or sometimes they want to bring in with a family prayer and those things. So these routines which people bring in routinely has a great amount of effect. And as patients are going through chronic insomnia, they might have forgotten a lot of these skill sets. So helping them to understand that will help. Exercise is extremely important to sleep better, but it is also important for them to understand the time of sleep. time of exercise, because some people, when they exercise, they become so activated that the sleep gets delayed. In those people, it is good for them to do exercise in the morning. There are some people who say, when I exercise, I feel tired, so I feel better sleep. So you have to ask the client who's sitting in front of you, how does sleep affect them? And try to make such appropriate changes with exercise. But definitely, routine exercise is important in getting back to routine sleep. So it's always good to also look at Zeitgebers. What is this Zeitgebers? Now, Zeitgeber is nothing but a time giver. Okay, Zeitgeber is nothing but a time giver. And this is something which I talk to a lot of my patients, because I've seen it's extremely effective when people try to follow these simple strategies, which doesn't cost them anything, but is extremely useful. What is a time giver or a Zeitgeber? Zeitgeber or a time giver is anything which can kind of give time to the biological clock inside us. Like, for example, of course, the bright light in the sunlight, and the dark skies in the night, that will give enough stimulation to the eyes and say it's morning, it's night, and give you the time. That's something which we all know, we have also spoken about. That's not the only thing. There's a lot of important components of Zeitgeber. The important components is people. Interaction with people itself can help people to understand time better. So one way our body knows what is the time of the day is with whom are you interacting, because there are some people whom we interact only in the evenings, there are some people whom we interact in the morning, some people who interact late in the night. So your body gets signals to understand what's the time of the day. So it's good to develop some routines of meeting people, or good to develop routines of kind of connecting with people in a particular way. That is a good time giver. Having work in a scheduled manner, work time, relaxation time, entertainment time, sports time, physical fitness time, like that, giving different time zones and working with it, building routines could really help as a Zeitgeber. Food, sleep, bowel habits, a routine time for food, sleep, bowel could also be a good Zeitgeber. Medications, for that matter. In a lot of my patients, they themselves will come and say, Doc, I don't know whether you're giving me a placebo or a medicine which works, but one thing I can tell you, I am taking these medicines regularly, and it at least helps me to get a routine. So I also don't know whether the medication is actually helping, or the routine of taking the medication is helping many times. And you need to understand the routine itself can be very, very effective. And that's an important Zeitgeber which we can work with, especially if you're working with clients with insomnia, or children and young adults with ADHD kind of problems, making them work with these kind of chronobiological strategies and Zeitgebers and those things will be extremely useful. I hope you remember, as a clinician, try to consider using melatonin as a chronobiological strategy, not as a strategy for just inducing sleep or something like that. To kind of get the rhythms, think of melatonin sometimes. You might find it effective in some patients, and the biggest advantage of it is it's quite safe and doesn't cause much of problems, and those it makes it very effective. So when you're talking about psychological interventions, those basic points are important, but you need to understand, talking about sleep hygiene in general, what are the do's and don'ts, what is that's extremely important. Stimulus control is extremely important. A simple stimulus control strategy to tell people is, you will not go to your bed unless you get sleep. If you're feeling sleepy, your eyes are droopy, then only you'll go to bed. And if you lie down and you don't get sleep for more than 30 minutes, get off the bed, do something else, doesn't matter, but don't be on bed lying around. So just making them away from bed always whenever they're not sleepy will improve their sleep efficiency significantly. Now, it is not as easy as what I tell. People find it very difficult to practice, but if you can help them to practice, you can make a difference in their quality of life. Relaxation techniques are extremely useful. I told you, right? A lot of us put off all the lights, put off the music, put off the sounds, we go to lie down. But what we don't put off is the lights in our head. Our lights in our head is still functioning. We are worrying, we are thinking about something else, future, past, that, this. So that is one of the common problems we see in our psychiatry patients, right? They have ruminations, they have depressive cognitions, they are anxious. So teaching them good relaxation techniques will We've seen patients benefiting a lot with yoga nidra. We've seen patients benefiting a lot with any kind of relaxation technique if it is practiced regularly. Progressive muscle relaxation is a beautiful strategy. We have seen clinically very effective. So to help these patients. Now, other than that, it's a good idea for always to work on retraining and restriction. It is important for us to sometimes tell the patients that if you're not getting sleep, don't sleep. It's okay. Keep yourself awake. Because a lot of times they want to go and sleep and they push themselves. They see when they try hard to sleep is when they will find it even more difficult to sleep. Because when they are trying hard, they're already anxious and worried and tense. So that itself will actually make sleep go away. So you need to understand that helping them to reduce their arousal, calming down, and telling them it's okay, chill, sleep will come naturally. Because sleep drive, which I told you in the beginning, the homeostatic processes or process S is very powerful. It will build up and get you into sleep. But you have to allow it to build up. You have to allow the adenosine to build up. You have to allow the circadian rhythm and the homeostatic process to work together. That's when you get great sleep. So I tell some of my patients, I say, sleep comes to you when you deserve sleep. So mentally, physically, psychologically, emotionally, when you do all the things as best as you can, then sleep slowly understands and it comes to you when you deserve sleep. So talking to them and making them understand and not become very anxious about it is a good skill set to transfer to the patients to deal with sleep much better. And it is important to understand there is something called a CBTI, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is a very useful, effective strategy in patients with any kind of insomnia, especially resistant sleep issues. It's an important strategy. Now, CBTI is basically a collection of all the things which I've been talking now, right from Zeitgeber's understanding psychoeducation about sleep, importance of sleep, hygiene, control, all put together is basically CBTI. So with this, I think I've kind of highlighted to you what's the importance of sleep, what happens with insomnia, and I've also given you some idea of how some of these medications work, what are the challenges you need to look for clinically. I've also specifically told you what you should look for when you're helping these patients with sleep. I'll try to see if there are some questions and I'll take up a few questions before we wind up for the day. But next time when a patient comes and says, I want a sleeping pill, our business is not as easy as write a prescription and send them. We need to ask ourselves, why are we needing to give medication? Which medication to give? Do they really need medication? We need to assess for other comorbidities. And most importantly, try a lot of psychological strategies along with this. That's when we should be able to kind of help these patients to handle sleep much better. So